I'm Vass and I host this Globe and Mail podcast, Lately.
And I'm Katrina Onsted. I'm the show's executive producer.
Katrina, have you been watching season 2 of Severance?
No, I saw season 1, but I don't have my apps in order, and I've not been able to access the second season yet, but I want to.
Okay, I'm glad you're generally familiar with the show because our introduction is predicated on it. It's so great. I think even if people haven't seen the show, they sort of have caught on to the gist by now, right? Mm-hmm. So the concept, Lumen Industries, an employer where employees have gone through a somewhat mysterious procedure that separates their brains, their selves, right, into two. Their innies, who are their more formal work selves, and then their outies, their home selves. And since you are familiar with the show, I was wondering if HR offered this service, would you go for it?
Yeah, I think maybe. I mean, I've definitely had jobs where that sounds very appealing. I like the idea of hitting a switch and never thinking about work after 6 p.m. I realize this is not the message of that show, by the way, but it's the end of the struggle for work-life balance. And so would you? You wouldn't do it? You'd never do it? I know you wouldn't.
No, I would.
You love work.
That's a separate episode on my relationship with typing, but I could maybe activate like my weekend self or something like that, but it doesn't really appeal to me. I find it hard to separate my work self from my other self, whoever she is. But that's between me and my AI chatbot. Handing over your brain to your workplace is actually not just science fiction for streamers, right? Brain monitoring on the job, hate to break it to you, is here. We're not quite in the space of implants and surgeries, but wearable neurotechnologies. Like there's this smart cap that monitors employee fatigue. I worry that I would really light it up.
Bing, 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 bing.
Yeah. Another example, Apple is working on AirPods that can monitor your brainwave activity.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Yeah. So maybe eventually your boss will know how fast you're picking up a new skill or how excited or not excited you are about that new project. And I don't want to seem like a conspiracy theorist, but I'm telling you, all of this leads straight to Elon Musk's Neuralink.
Yeah. Okay, so explain this connection because I keep hearing this too.
So, okay. Neuralink is that BCI, brain-computer interface implant that he's been developing.
Right.
It's like a coin-sized brain chip that's surgically implanted under your skull, and it can monitor and stimulate brain activity using electrical currents. So the promise and kind of the best possible application is that it can read signals from a paralyzed patient's brain and then transmit that data to, say, a phone or a computer. That means the patient can control devices with just their thoughts, right? No swiping, no typing, and they can, do things they weren't able to do before.
There's obviously extraordinary medical possibilities here, and it was recently greenlit by Health Canada for a clinical trial here, focusing on helping people with quadriplegia. Great. But there's also some speculation about whether or not this could end up in the workplace, right? Imagine this, Elon Musk in our brains. And maybe that's just the inevitable leveling up because less dramatically, we are already being monitored, right? Our emails, websites, chats, phone calls, you can pretty much assume that everything you do or write or say on company time and across their devices, especially every Slack you compose.
No.
Yes, ours are often about your little obsession with clean talk videos.
That's very healthy.
Every one of those is delightfully being reviewed, probably. They can and they might read it. And AI is just going to allow employers to get through a greater volume of employee output. And we know this. We don't like it. But for the most part, we seem to kind of passively accept it.
Yeah, I think sometimes people don't fully appreciate kind of what's going on or what's possible on that back end. But the neurotechnology market is here and it's growing. We are using the definition that says neurotech is any technology that interfaces with the nervous system, and it's estimated to grow to $21 billion by 2026. And these technologies are expected to completely change workplaces, right? Now, management has always argued that surveillance tech holds this promise of improving productivity. But what about the dystopian invasion of privacy part?
Yeah, exactly. Like, where's the privacy commissioner on all of this?
The bar is pretty low. They don't really have our backs quite yet. It turns out that Ontario's the only province that mandates if a company of more than 25 employees, so already pretty decent size, is using a surveillance tool, all it needs to do is disclose that to workers.
Right. So we might not know, or it might have been in small print in our contracts, exactly what kind of surveillance is at work, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like there isn't much to protect employees from this quote unquote bossware.
You know, bossware makes it sound so much sassier than it is. To make sense of the promise and peril of this increasingly sophisticated surveillance, we reached out to Dr. David Murakami Wood. He's the Canada Research Chair in Critical Surveillance and Security Studies and a professor at the University of Ottawa. I was pretty productive during our interview.
Oh, I know you were, because I had the implant. Tell me.
Well, Big Brother called and he wants his spyware back. This is Lately. David, why did you wait until just 2 years ago to get a mobile phone?
How did you know that?
I've been surveilling you.
Yeah. I didn't have a mobile phone for most of my life, and it was partly because of surveillance, and partly because I was a surveillance researcher, and I was well aware of the potential hazards involved in this. For most of the 90s, before I was a researcher, I was an activist for environment, peace, and social justice. So I was well aware that not only could I be watched and could I be monitored, but I had been in the past. I was part of a group that won damages against the British government for illegal surveillance of their activities. Now, I've had to give in the last couple of years for personal reasons, and I now have a mobile phone, but I use it basically as a phone. I don't use any of the kind of things on my phone that many other people would use. And I have the most basic model of iPhone that you can still get and still link up to any networks. But yeah, this shows the problem though. If you want to reject, and if you want to stay outside, it's now almost impossible to do so with the realities of life across the whole range of our living spectrum, whether it's personal to workplace. It is now almost impossible to stay outside of surveillance and to say, I reject surveillance and I'm going to go somewhere else. So I had to give in.
How common is surveillance at work?
Well, it's probably used by almost all workplaces in some way. One of the things is that we don't often recognize the existing forms of workplace surveillance that are already there, predating the digital. So we have a massive surge of digital techniques, new techniques of surveillance, and people are very worried about them, and they should be. But let's not forget that, almost every aspect of the workplace as an institution is set up to be a surveillance entity, right? This is exactly what capital has always wanted, and managers have always wanted, is to have complete control over people to ensure maximum productivity, right? So the first thing is we shouldn't forget that all workplaces are fundamentally controlled by surveillance, and that's the way it's always been.
You mentioned some of the newer technologies in this space as well. I noticed that CNBC reported some huge employers like Walmart, T-Mobile, Starbucks are actually monitoring their staff's Slack messages, right? So not necessarily reading them in real time, but using computer software, using algorithms to monitor them. And they're monitoring them, and this is a quote, to track employee sentiment and toxicity. That's at least what the creator of the program said about it. What are corporations trying to do with this information?
Well, I think there's two fundamental things they're doing. One is that many of these corporations, especially in the US context, but also in Canada, are fundamentally interested in either preventing or limiting the power of unions and unionization. So they want to stop workers organizing together, but also of any kind of criticism of the company or workplace conditions. And this, of course, has been only accelerated by the platform tech boom, because many of these companies, especially the CEOs, have shown themselves to be utterly opposed to unions as an idea. Elon Musk is one example of this. He's, completely and utterly opposed to the idea of unions in any shape or form. And many other tech CEOs have similar views to that. So that's the first thing, is it's a union busting move. But the other one is that many of these companies are, interested in trying to predict essentially how employees will react to certain things. This includes sort of workplace transformations, changes to working practices, and they can see, they argue in advance how people are going to react to these things, whether there's going to be discontent, whether there's going to be trouble, and even on a personal level, how individual workers, are seen to be overly negative, for example, or, making statements that might be seen as, even if not directly critical, just damaging to some kind of idea of workplace morale or productivity. And of course, this is incredibly subjective and incredibly skewed towards the side of what management thinks is an appropriate or otherwise attitude in the workplace.
The other thing that this kind of technology can do is attempt to make inferences about your mood based on the tone of your written messages, right? So now we know, even if we don't really like that, our bosses could maybe read an email or a Slack message that we send through a company system. But now it seems like it's not just what you say, but how you say it, both in written form and out loud, right? Through voice. Why are we treating this layer like it matters?
I don't think we should, and I don't think we are when we talk about ourselves. I think this is another way in which bosses think they can access some kind of hidden self that we can keep away from their conventional forms of surveillance. So they think if we can elude all these more superficial forms of surveillance, somehow with these newer forms, they can get below the surface. They can start to dig in and find out what the real truth is. I mean, we saw this in policing decades ago. In the 90s and 2000s, we started to see the rise of new forms of biometric monitoring connected to CCTV. So facial recognition has been the next big thing for the last 25 years, right? This is not new. I wrote an article about facial recognition in 2003, I think, about the dangers of facial recognition. It wasn't new then. I wasn't the first person to be writing about this. And yet we're still getting the same things saying that facial recognition will solve these problems. All these new systems attached to it will solve all our problems. At that time, the FBI in the USA were pioneering what they called micro-expression recognition. And what they were saying is that there were tiny sort of muscular tells that would be available by close analysis of the face. They again could tell whether somebody was about to do something. Somebody was basically doing something against what they were saying or what they were expressing in other ways. And they argued this was like something you couldn't spoof. These were like subdermal cues that were moving tiny groups of muscles around the eyes and things. Most of this has been almost completely discredited. And in fact, micro-expression recognition and micro-expression analysis is regarded with the same kind of, skepticism as lie detection in many ways now, which was an equally supposedly scientific method that was shown to be completely bogus in the sense that it was just measured stress.
Right.
And people can be stressed for all kinds of reasons. So I think the key thing with a lot of this stuff is just because it's being automated, just because we're having a layer of AI added to it, the magic fairy dust of AI is being sprinkled on it, it doesn't mean that suddenly the underlying science is sound. It's not. In fact, it hides the fact that the underlying science is bogus to begin with. You don't get to look at that anymore. It's the classic black boxing. AI creates another black box around the existing black box,
So why spy on your workers in that way? Like, why try to be listening in to all sorts of things that people are saying at the workplace?
Paranoia, fear. I mean, fundamentally, managers are afraid that they will lose control. This is one of the fundamental dynamics of power relations in any situation. Lewis Mumford, the great scholar of urbanism, famously said that, that cities were an expression of the paranoia of kingship. That the idea of the creation of cities was designed to concentrate people in one space, but that immediately creates a kind of paranoia that your subjects will rebel, will overthrow you. They can talk, they can discuss, they can organize amongst themselves. And workplaces, are the same kind of entities in that sense. They are spaces in which there is utter control, but there is also incredible paranoia amongst those in control that they will lose control. And, it's not just that these people are like dictators. In many cases, we're talking about middle management. We're talking about people whose own jobs depend on them having a sense of control and, in fact, demonstrating a sense of control, demonstrating increased productivity, demonstrating these things. The managers themselves are also subject to metrics and datafication. And so they pass that on down, it goes down the chain.
Maybe we could talk about the evolution of surveillance at the workplace a little bit more. I know you were telling me it's kind of always been part of the fabric of work, but it's becoming more digitized now. Because employers have sort of always watched workers, should we treat this as something that's new?
I don't think we should ever treat it as something that's normal. It's not new, but it shouldn't be regarded as normal. Pre-industrial conditions meant that workers were often very much more independent in many cases, especially, people who worked in the weaving industry, for example, back in the 18th century, were relatively independent. They could control their own production. And these are the people who became what, are popularly known as Luddites, ones who resisted being forced to move into factories, resisted the centralization of their work. And this wasn't about them being anti-technology. It was precisely about them losing their independence, losing their ability to control their own work. And this is exactly what surveillance is designed to enforce, that sense that people are not in control of their own work, that they are subject to management dictates, they are subject to orders, and they have to buckle under and obey those. And you saw with the pandemic just how much this was true. So when people were forced to move to remote work, then you saw an increase, a massive increase in digital surveillance, the imposition of spyware on workers' computers, active monitoring, all these kinds of different systems. A lot of them came in during the pandemic on the grounds that basically managers were no longer in the same space and therefore were not able to sort of more physically control workers. So you had to turn to these new digital technologies. But it's fundamentally that really demonstrated that same, kind of idea that this was always about this sense of control.
You mentioned spyware and that monitoring kind of moving. And it does sort of seem like what we're talking about now is a migration of practices, right? Sort of something that we became used to as consumers, being tracked online, being watched kind of passively. And that's moving into the workplace, right? Now, employers are sort of collecting data from us or from workers in the same way that a company like Amazon collects information about shoppers. Does that spillover sort of sound right to you?
Absolutely, and it works both ways. And what I mean by that is that not only are the same kinds of practices that were developed for market research and for surveillance of consumers being deployed on workers, but also the kind of information that bosses are collecting about workers is exactly the kind of information that used to be considered private and in the realm of the domestic or the personal. So, when we were talking earlier about things like sentiment analysis, this is something that, would in the past, and probably I hope still is, would have been regarded as private information, as personal information that's outside the realm of the workplace and of what bosses are legitimately allowed to know. But we've seen an increasing move of companies into the private sphere of workers. And I think this started probably with drug testing in the workplace. So this is something that US companies frequently deploy. And it started obviously in industries where there was, genuine danger of people being impaired. So for example, if you're operating a forklift truck in a workplace or operating anything you could drive or heavy machinery, there's a real concern about impairment, right? Whatever that is from, whether it's alcohol or drugs. But US companies have seen an expansion of that into many other industries, and especially hair testing of workers is something that expanded in the 90s and 2000s. And there's been several court cases about the viability of hair testing, not least because hair testing is incredibly, first of all, unreliable, but also in the case of some particular narcotics and substances, like, for example, cannabis, it stays for a very long time in hair and actually can also remain in hair from other passive sources. So it's an incredibly unreliable method. And this is the problem with many of the newer methods that get used, is that the reliability of many of these methods is not generally assessed in practice until after it's been implemented. We have laboratory tests. We have basically unrealistic conditions under which these things have been tested in many cases, even just pure simulations in the case of much digital surveillance. But actual testing, the workplace is it, right? The place where it's introduced is the test.
So then as subjects here, why do you think we tend to sort of accept, even begrudgingly, that companies are grabbing onto our data when we shop or browse online, but then we tend to recoil at that same practice when it's applied in the workplace?
Because we have no choice. I mean, fundamentally, even with online shopping, we know we have other options. And in some ways, it's treated as sort of frivolous, as a consumer activity, something that's not serious. But, the whole point about the workplace relationship is that that's your life. If you don't have a job, you don't get paid. That's everything.
One of the ways I've seen the implementation of this technology dressed up is in the name of efficiency. Do you think that surveillance is actually efficient? Do these technologies make people more productive, keep them more engaged with their tasks at work?
Well, the evidence seems to suggest, and there's been a lot of research about this, that in fact that is not the case. It would seem in common sense terms to be obvious that more control equals more productivity. You remember the classic movie Modern Times with Charlie Chaplin working on the production line. And the idea is that,
Right.
the supervisor stands behind them and makes sure they continue to work in a very productive and efficient way. But even, of course, in that early example, way back in the 1920s, 30s, everything starts to go wrong. Things don't end up being more efficient. People object, people fail, systems fail. And if there's one rule about any of these things, is that almost all the expectations about efficiency are not borne out by the research. And in fact, it's actually worse than that. In many cases, these things are actively counterproductive. They make workers feel paranoid. They make workers feel like they're under watch and therefore react against it in various ways. Workers find new and ingenious ways to spoof systems. They find ways to drag their heels, to sabotage, to kick back. And there's been some excellent research on this kind of thing. Right going back to James C. Scott's fantastic book on everyday forms of peasant resistance, which he showed how peasants in Malaysia under colonialism didn't fight back by forming, kind of active resistance, but they did it by passive forms, by just making things slower, by dragging their heels, by little acts of petty sabotage. And this happens everywhere. And the more surveillance you put on people, the more people react against it and find ways to counteract it and to resist it.
So where do you see that current resistance taking place? Either, place-based, through algorithms, through computer systems too? Where is it happening?
Well, funnily enough, you mentioned Slack earlier on. One of the ways and one of the reasons why that bosses want to monitor Slack and Discord and other kinds of, co-working tools is precisely because those were the places, or have been the places, where the sort of shared stories and resistance and tips of, about how to kind of avoid surveillance, how to do things in ways that seem to be conforming but are not, are actually shared. One of the classic ones, of course, is when keystroke monitoring was introduced, especially in back offices.
Right.
So we're talking about, things like customer support centers and things like this. Keystroke monitoring was used to check that workers were actually using the keyboard a certain amount. The early versions weren't very sophisticated, and basically you could spoof them by just randomly hitting keys while you were doing something else. So you could be chatting with your coworker, drinking a cup of coffee, and then just hitting keys with your fingers, like the cat in the video, And that worked quite well until bosses, of course, worked out this was the case. And then you have sort of more active forms. So then you introduce secondary forms of surveillance to check that the primary form of surveillance is being conformed to. So when you have keystroke monitoring plus maybe, eye recognition types of software that check that your eyes are looking in a certain direction. Mm-hmm. So then, of course, workers work out that you can also spoof that. You can look at the camera and still do this and still be talking to someone else. So you have to record conversations and it's so on and so on. So, this is one of the other sort of, if you like, laws of surveillance, is that every form of surveillance fails in ways that gives rise to a new form of surveillance to make sure that the first form either works or, is supplemented.
We've been talking a little bit more about white-collar jobs and the application of surveillance. We do know that surveillance has been more common, or maybe most common, in blue-collar jobs. I'm thinking of Amazon workers and those infamous monitored bathroom breaks, gig workers on apps like Uber Eats, having their delivery speed kind of constantly tracked and their route. Is this stuff true? Is it important? Why is it still happening?
I'm a relatively privileged, older, male, white researcher. I'm exactly the kind of person who always says nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right? Because most of the surveillance capacities are not targeted at people like me. But fundamentally, bosses don't trust workers. They don't think workers are going to voluntarily give their all to the company, and they're quite right. They won't. They actually have to introduce measures by which they think workers will conform involuntarily. And Amazon is one of the best examples of this. It's not just the things they have introduced. They hold all kinds of patents for different technologies that they could introduce, some of which are far more dystopian than what we've seen them actually using in practice. They also had that famous incident where they tried to ameliorate this by introducing a kind of confessional box where you could actually enter the box and kind of like escape. They had an escape box, essentially, they introduced into some of their facilities where you could actually have temporary respite from surveillance and observation.
Oh.
And basically, some people described it as like a screaming box or something.
Oh my
You
gosh.
could go in there and scream and escape for a second. But that just showed to some extent that even they recognized the extent to which they've gone, how far they've gone in workplace surveillance, that they even felt they needed to provide workers with like a tiny space they could escape from this surveillance. It's insane.
You've said that we've done pretty well, but I think on the productivity measures, we haven't. And that, our need for more productivity could be the Trojan horse for more of these technologies. At the same time, I have to wonder if maybe we're overthinking it, right? Like if you're on company time, and if you're doing nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. Does that sort of implied logic hold for you?
I don't think so. And I think, that doesn't hold in any circumstance. I think that's a recipe for mistrust, and it's the slippery slope. And once you've gone down there, you end up with a surveillance society in which, surveillance is always the answer because you never trust anybody, right? But I think the fundamental question is a key one. The idea that productivity in that sense is, first of all, the measure we should judge these things by, but also that productivity is necessarily increased by repressive measures.
Right.
Now, we know from research that the best thing for increasing productivity is reducing the 5-day week to a 4-day week. We know this, right? And we know that in Scandinavian countries or in France where they've tried these measures, productivity does not decrease. In fact, people are happier, people report higher levels of satisfaction, and they actually work harder in the times that they are at work. And this actually more than compensates for the fact that there's a loss of a day. Mm-hmm. All of those countries also have better welfare systems. They have better minimum wages. They have better support for workers in the workplace. So, I think the answer to most of these things is not to go down the American neoliberal route of cutting support, cutting state benefits, cutting regulation, and then using, basically force and surveillance to increase productivity. The answer is actually to go back to an idea that workers have a stake in society and in companies, and to give workers greater control, pay workers more, give workers more time off, in general, to improve the lives of working people. And I think you'll find that then people actually are more inclined to work harder, in a way that's more voluntary. And that's what you want in the end.
I don't know if you know this about me, but I am pretty into speculative fiction. And
Me too.
when I'm not reading books about this kind of stuff, I've been reading about facial recognition as part of performance reviews at work, right? And this technology is sort of here. It's often referred to as emotion AI, right? A new technology. Can you talk a little bit more about this evolution? Because I want to know when my resting bitch face became a career liability.
Well, exactly. And for those of us who don't communicate in a conventional way and have slightly non-neurotypical mannerisms, which I don't, basically, I've always been told that I should look at people when I talk to them. And, there's this whole idea from American policing that if you don't look at the person you're talking to, you're lying or untrustworthy. And it's one of their classic tells of a guilty party. I mean, I spend all my time looking elsewhere. I find it very difficult to concentrate on looking at somebody directly, as you can probably tell, right? Because we're doing that right now. So even when I'm paying close attention to somebody, I'm listening to everything they're saying, I'm looking all over the place. I'm watching squirrels outside as well, as there is right now. Doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. But, if you take the kind of classic policing sort of view, that makes me guilty, right? That makes me potentially a criminal. And so a lot of these technologies, it's not just about the technology themselves, it's about the things on which they are based, the sort of pseudo-psychological research on which the assumptions that will derive from this are based. A lot of this is based on really untested and assumed sort of forms of pseudoscience about what you can read from human faces. It's also based on a really normative idea of what human faces are and what they do, and the person behind those faces and how it's manifests in their faces. So people who are non-neurotypical in all kinds of ways, and we tend to assume that means autistic or on the autistic spectrum, but there's a whole variety of non-neurotypical types of person. I live with mental illness. I have, that in my life, and it means that I'm not exactly the same. I don't react the same. I don't facially react the same as some other people. And these things are all built in. These assumptions and these ideas about normativity are built into facial recognition systems, which then claim that they can judge not only how people think now, but how they might think in the future. It should be treated with the same contempt as, we now treat phrenology and, the ideas of bumps on your head determining your future. This should be treated with the same complete contempt as that.
Mm-hmm. I was reading about some surveillance tech at the workplace that's really safety oriented, like a high-tech helmet worn by people working in a mine, or a wearable for firefighters that kind of measured smoke exposure, and just sort of wondered, is there an upside here? Like, is surveillance at a workplace ever appropriate?
Yeah, I think these kind of environmental forms of surveillance, they fit into that category of, caring forms of surveillance that actually are about worker safety. In the case of things like, contaminant detection or gas detection in mines, you can't say this is a bad thing, right? If people don't die in mines, it's a good thing. It might be a form of surveillance, but not every form of surveillance is necessarily repressive or taking away workers' rights. This is fundamentally about the interaction between the environment and the worker, right? And it's protecting the worker from environmental hazards. That's a good thing. If it's used to reduce other forms of supervision and monitoring that would otherwise have protected the worker, then it gets more problematic. So sometimes some of these technologies are used to actually reduce the numbers of people working in a particular environment. So you have very high-tech equipped workers who can do the job of, say, 2 or 3 other people who used to be in this industry. And then so you get like kind of a reduction in worker numbers. So it's used really to be a justification for rationalization, again, productivity. But of course, let's not forget the other side of the productivity debate is always getting rid of workers, right? If you can make people do more for less, you can get rid of the numbers of workers you have. That's also a productivity gain as far as the company is concerned. It's certainly a profit gain. So yes, it's good, but you've got to look at what it's really being used for as part of a whole package.
Dr. Wood, thank you for answering our call and for this conversation today.
It's been a real pleasure.
You've been listening to Lately, a Globe and Mail podcast. Our executive producer is Katrina Onstad. The show is produced by Jay Coburn, and our sound designer is Cameron McIver. And I'm your host, Vass Bednar. In our show notes, you can subscribe to the Lately newsletter, where the Globe's online culture reporter, Samantha Edwards, unpacks more of the latest in business and technology. A new episode of Lately comes out every Friday, wherever you get your podcasts.